If I told you that Pokemon's a super complicated and deep universe, you'd probably laugh at me. I mean, you run around the region catching cute little creatures and having them battle, and if you play the games or watch the anime casually, that's probably all it seems there is. But you might be surprised to find out that there's actually a ton of lore beyond that, spanning hundreds of millions of years. See, before Pokeballs or gyms or even humans walked the earth, there was just chaos. Well, chaos and an egg. And today I want to tell you about how from that egg, we got one of the deepest and most rich universes we have in all of fiction. Because today we're talking about the Pokemon creation myth explained. But before we get into any of that, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the page, and ring that bell. See, at the start of the video, I had mentioned that the Pokemon universe started as this empty space of chaos and nothingness, and at the center was an egg. Well, that egg would eventually hatch into the first being of the universe, and that's Arceus. But it's not the Arceus that you know. See, it's not like that horse llama looking thing. No, see, that's just an avatar of Arceus, because it's not until Pokemon Legends Arceus where we actually get to travel to the realm that Arceus exists in, and we learn that it's just this massive ball of light. Whenever Arceus wants to interact with its creation, it takes off a chunk of itself and then creates an avatar out of that, and that's what it sends to the actual world. Whenever Arceus does this, it actually shows up surrounded by 19 different plates. These are known as life plates, and it's kind of what gives Arceus its power. It has one for each type, so one for, and I'm going to read them because I will inevitably forget one: normal, fighting, flying, poison, ground, rock, bug, ghost, steel, fire, water, grass, electric, psychic, ice, dragon, dark, and fairy. And you're probably thinking to yourself, that's 18. But it also has one extra called the Legend Plate, and the Legend Plate kind of encompasses all of the types combined. Arceus would then go on to create the universe, and in some Pokedex entries it's stated to use its 1,000 arms to do so. This has led some to theorize that the 1,000 arms are actually the unknown. But we're not really theorizing in this video, that might be a topic for later. To get back on track, Arceus created the universe, but it isn't necessarily a big fan of governing it. Instead, at the peak of Mount Coronet in the middle of the Hisui or Sinnoh region, it created 3 beings to help it govern, and that's going to be Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina, who govern time, space, and antimatter respectively. Now, in addition to creating Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina, Arceus actually created a separate dimension for each one of them, so that they could live there and not cause trouble in the real world. Because when they were there, they would start to cause distortions and it would start to destroy things. Dialga and Palkia mostly stayed in their lane. They stayed in their dimension and governed their part of reality. Giratina, on the other hand, he liked to cause some trouble, and so he actually stayed in the real world and was destroying Arceus' creation. Arceus wasn't okay with that, obviously, so he decided to lock Giratina in his dimension, and that dimension is actually known as the Distortion World. The Distortion World is exactly what it sounds like, a world where reality is distorted. You have water that flows upwards, you have floating platforms, and you can walk on walls there. It's completely chaotic, and this is where Giratina resides. Speaking of dimensions, there's actually a few more in the Pokemon universe that we know of. There's the Unknown Dimension, where the Unknown reside. We've seen it a couple of times in the anime, like in the Entei movie. There's also the Mirror World, which is a direct reflection of the real world in Pokemon. So anything in the Mirror World has the exact opposite personality that it has in the real world. So if you were incredibly brave in the real world, you're really timid over there, and vice versa. There's also the Ghost World, which we don't know a ton about, but we do know that it's the home of all Ghost-type Pokemon, and Dusknoir's Pokedex entry actually mentions that it receives transmissions from that world, instructing it to drag people there. The newest one we've been introduced to is called Ultra Space. It's the whole plot of Sun and Moon, and it's home to Pokemon like Solgaleo, Lunala, and Necrozma. Because it's so new, it's still being researched in the Pokemon universe, and it's got a good bit of lore, so if I'm going to talk about it, I want to dedicate a whole video to it, so we're not really going to talk about it in this one. Now, like I said, Arceus doesn't really want to have to govern his creation once he's created it. He's kind of a bum in that. And so, in order to get out of that responsibility, he creates an egg. And this egg hatches into three different beings: the embodiment of willpower in Azelf, the embodiment of emotion in Mesprit, and the embodiment of knowledge in Yuxi. And when these three combine, they're able to subdue one of the creation trio, but only ever one at a time. Now, once these three hatch, they decide to dive down into one of each of the three lakes in the Hisui or Sinnoh region. And these are Lake Acuity, Lake Valor, and Lake Verity. And this is how they became known as the Lake Guardians. Now, to cover what happens next, we actually have to sidestep from Sinnoh and move over to the neighboring region of Hoenn. And here, the primal energies in the world have created two beings on their own, and that's Kyogre coming from the sea and Groudon coming from the land. Now, Kyogre and Groudon are what are known as the super ancient Pokemon, and this is because they existed well before most of the other Pokemon in the world. And they're actually responsible for creating the oceans and the land masses, respectively. But they also take their jobs super seriously. So when they run into each other in a chance encounter one day, they're fighting immediately. Luckily, though, in the ozone layer, the primal energies had mixed to create a third legendary, and that's Rayquaza. And Rayquaza's just like a pissed off parent with a hero complex, so he sees Kyogre and Groudon fighting and comes down to stop it. And Kyogre and Groudon, when they see Rayquaza, they're like, whoa man, this game's rated E for everyone, chill out. And Rayquaza's like, yeah, so are these hands, so y'all better calm down. And since neither Kyogre nor Groudon really wants the smoke with Rayquaza, that's how the feud comes to an end. Now, during this time, biodiversity wasn't really a big thing yet, and so aside from the Pokemon that I've listed so far, the main species on Earth is just Mew. But there's actually one more Pokemon that I haven't mentioned yet, and that's because we don't really know how or when it was created. We just know that it was probably around this time, and that's going to be Regigigas. See, we can probably assume that Arceus created Regigigas as kind of like the interior designer for the Pokemon world. And that's because now, after Kyogre and Groudon's feud, we have a large landmass, but we don't really have the regions that we have today. Those were actually towed to where they are now by Regigigas. So at some point, Regigigas breaks up this big landmass and moves the regions to where they are now. It's during these really violent seismic shifts caused by Regigigas moving the continents into place that areas like Stark Mountain form, where the primal energies mix with things like the lava just below the crust of the earth and create new species like Heatran. Now, one of the last things that Arceus does directly is create the Adamant Crystal, the Lustrous Orb, and the Griseous Core, which are all artifacts that are respectively connected to Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina. After it does this, it decides, you know what? I've done enough, I've seen enough, I'm taking a nap. And so Arceus goes into a deep slumber. See, it's at this point, now that we have all these different regions and areas of the world, that life is slowly starting to adapt to it. The Mew population is dwindling in favor of adapting into the prehistoric Pokemon that we revive as fossils in the games. It's at this time, around 300 million years before the games, that Genesect's ancestor was alive. And honestly, it was probably a Kabutops, because Kabuto and Kabutops were alive around this time as well. Another Pokemon that would start popping up around this time is Carbink, because similar to how Heatran formed under the pressures of Stark Mountain, Carbink is actually forming under the intense temperatures and pressures underground. As the world continues to develop over the next couple hundred millions of years, the other fossil Pokemon would start to pop up. Pokemon like Omanite and Aerodactyl and Tortuga and Archon, who are particularly important because Tortuga is actually the ancestor of all turtle Pokemon. So things like Blastoise and Turtonator, they wouldn't exist without Tortuga. And the same can be said for Archon with bird Pokemon. So like Pidgeot, Staraptor, Corviknight. So just those two Pokemon lines alone paved the way for so many more Pokemon species in the future to develop. Another example of this is actually Anorith, who's the predecessor of all bug-type Pokemon and also popped up around this time. So things like Beedrill, Butterfree, Heracross, Orbeetle, they can trace their roots back to Anorith in this time period. Fossil Pokemon aren't the only ones that are appearing around this time though. There's a couple others that are popping up. There's Relicanth, who is still said to have not changed at all since this time. There's also Shellder and its evolution Cloyster, who were preyed on by Omanite and Omastar. And then another example is Tropius, who popped up around this time. Pokemon species would continue to adapt and evolve from here to fill out most of what we know in the Pokedex. But we also do know of a few species that came from outer space and landed on Earth or the Moon. One of these, obviously since I mentioned the Moon, I have to bring up Clefairy and its evolution line. And then another one is Behem and Elgyem, who came from a distant planet and ended up on Earth. Speaking of distant planets, though, there's also Deoxys, the space virus that ended up on Earth and is now a rival for Rayquaza. And then another space Pokemon that's associated with Rayquaza is actually Minior, who's actually Rayquaza's favorite food, funnily enough. Now, I've pretty much told you everything there is about Pokemon's creation myth, but there's still over 100 million years of history that I haven't touched yet. From the rise and fall of different clans to how different regions got settled, but I actually think there's so much there that we should cover it in a different video. So, I actually think that's everything I have for you today, guys. The entire creation myth of Pokemon explained. But let me know down below, did you learn anything today? And what part of Pokemon's history are you excited for me to cover next? And as a reminder, if you like this video or like this kind of analysis content, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and ring that bell, because I'll have a new video out every single week. But until then, have a good day.